Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the Actual Magicians. Yes, I am an Actual Magicians Explained series, where today we're going to be taking a look at magical formula. And it's perhaps not the sexiest part of occultism, esotericism and magic, but it's a really important part, and we're going to be taking a look in particular at some references in Aleister Crowley's Magick in Theory and Practice. This one is edited and annotated and introduced by John Cinnamons and Kenneth Grant. And we're also going to be doing it with our blank sheet of paper as well, on which we're going to draw a tree of life. So I hope you're getting used to drawing a tree of life by now in your studies. That's always the foundation of what we're about to do. And Aleister Crowley makes several important points about formula. And one of the things that he does is he weaves this in and out of the section on Magick in Theory and Practice, where we're talking about ceremony. And it's all very well and good to be able to invoke, evoke, summon, dispel, and all of the other wonderful acts of magic that Crowley talks about. But there are foundational things that we need to do first, and it's really important, and often because it's not the sexiest thing to look at in terms of evoking the ninth spirit of the fourth ether of the third realm of the Enochian plane, then this gets overlooked, but it's really practical, it's really important, and so we're going to take a look at it. Crowley introduces it with the formula of the elemental weapons, which is part 2, chapter 2, of this section of Magick in Theory and Practice. And he says that each of the weapons, the elemental weapons of the dagger, the cup or chalice, grail, the wand and the pentacle or layman, all of these items have their own formula. And a magical formula is basically a pattern or a process or a model, often encoded in the language of ritual, but also in the language of the Hebrew letters. And Crowley talks about that, if I can find the relevant section, where he says that there are all sorts of misunderstandings about magical formula and their use. And he says, with this understanding, we may rehabilitate the Hebrew system of invocations. The mind is the great enemy. So by invoking enthusiastically a person whom we know not to exist, we are rebuking the mind. So in effect, he's saying that the nonsensical nature of correspondence leads to an overwhelming of the logical process of the mind for the reality of the mind's actual relationship to reality to impose itself, to actually be revealed through invocation, evocation, summoning, or consecration, whatever particular ritual you're doing. And he points out this: yet we should not refrain altogether from philosophizing in the light of the Holy Kabbalah. We should accept the magical hierarchy as a more or less convenient classification of the facts of the universe as they are known to us. And as our knowledge and understanding of these facts increase, so should we endeavour to adjust our idea of what we mean by any symbol. At the same time, let us reflect that there is a certain definite consensus of experience as to the correlation of the various beings of the hierarchy with the observed facts of magic. And he goes on to give some examples of how correspondence actually works. So in magic, he then goes on to talk about the formula of Alhim and of Alim. And he talks about that in terms of what he sees as witchcraft, which is the mere rearrangement of inert matter from one form to another, and almost a form of black magic, which is interesting because Crowley doesn't refer to what a lot of people would think in terms of his definition of black magic. And obviously some people call Aleister Crowley a black magician. but he only called one person a black magician, which was Austin Osman Spare. And his definition of black magic and witchcraft is basically a non-spiritual form of magic, a form of magic that is only designed to move your material world around and not to raise you in a straight line up through the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel and to a deeper, more profound, more consistent, comprehensive and congruent understanding and knowledge and wisdom of the point of the universe itself. And Crowley sees anything that's just messing around in the stalls as a form of black magic. And despite that, obviously his books are full of actual rituals and so forth. So the formula of Alhim and Alhim is not one we're going to be taking a look at. Quite interestingly, he also says that there is a formula for each of the grades, for each of the steps in the initiation system. And we might look at that in a future video, or that might be something that I'm going to add into a future volume of the Magister series that we're currently revising for publication at the moment. The formula of IAO, Isis, Apophis, Osiris, is one we are going to take a look at, and this has a identification, as Crowley says, with the word Lux, LVX, which is also used in the Rose Cross ritual. So there's a lot of importance to understanding these basic formula. And also, just to refer to the formula of the neophytes, he does give an indication of what he means by a formula in section 6, part 6 of this part of Magic and Theory and Practice. And here the formula of the neophyte is basically a description of the neophyte ritual of the Golden Dawn, and he breaks it down to the formula of inert matter being given motion. And in effect, that's what the neophyte ritual is basically about, is moving yourself to become a zealotor by saying, I think that there is more to the universe than meets the eye. I'm going to study it. I'm going to find out what the hell is going on. What is reality? Who am I? What am I? What is the relationship between identity and reality? In any of its forms, I'm going to find out, and you set yourself off in a straight line. And that is basically a self-initiation into the neophyte grade. You have set yourself in motion, and the neophyte ritual is merely giving a form to that, a formula to that, a structure to that, a set of symbols that you can then unpack as you go through your zealotor stage. And this is why the study of correspondence, Kabbalah and so forth, and magical formula is so important to the neophyte and zealotor stages. It may not make much sense to you to begin with, but by further practice, it becomes really useful, and you start to see these patterns and formula in all of the things that are going on around you, whether it's a queue at the supermarket or something happening in the political sphere or something that happens in a sports game. It can be all sorts of things, but you see these formula in action. So I'm going to do two formula, I think. We looked at the formula of QShTh in our previous video on our live construction of a ritual in real time that we worked together. That was really cool. And QShTh was something that I think we looked at in that video. So I'll briefly mention that as well and what that means. We're going to take a look at Isis, Apophis, Osiris, which is also LVX, which spelled in Latin, making a Latin word, is lux, meaning light. So it's the formula of light. This is the formula of the rainbow. And the formula that I'm particularly going to look at is PRDS. And those of you who followed my tarot work will have seen how I apply this within tarot, which is also what we're going to do today. This is the formula of paradise. So let's just quickly draw a tree of life so we can start to place these on the tree. And again, this serves as our structure, our filing cabinet and so forth. So I'll draw this in real time so that you can see how I tend to draw it. Keith, being a hot man, do those the other way around. Let's do them down the tree in order. Okay, so we draw the Sephiroth, the numerical emanations first, and then we can draw the outside paths on them, like so. We can draw the vertical paths up them, like so. We can draw the horizontal paths on them, like so. And we can do all of the diagonals, including the tricky ones that go up like that. So we have our 22 paths and we have our tree of life. Look, no template. So when we have the tree of life, we can take a look at QShTh in particular, and then we're going to look at PRDS as well, paradise, and see how these apply. So QShTh is basically the Hebrew letters that correspond to the bottom of the tree of life. So Kof, Shin, and Tau. Just looking at the screen. If you see me looking in this direction, I'm looking at the screen so I can see what I'm pointing to. So QShTh is the Hebrew word for rainbow, and this in effect is the rainbow that arches over the bottom of the tree of life like so. It means bow, and the tarot cards to which these letters correspond give us an illustration of the formula, which is the best way, I guess, to actually see what the formula is all about. And that is the world there. So we have the Last Judgment for Shin, connecting Hod and Malkuth. We have the Moon, Kof, connecting Netzach and Malkuth. And then we have the World, connecting Yesod and Malkuth for Tau. And interestingly enough, Tau also means cross in Hebrew, and we can see that we have a cross that is formed here. This is the cross on which the adept, in the Adeptus Minor ritual, is sacrificed in the Christian symbolism of the sacrifice on the cross. But that's where you can see it on the tree of life. There's the cross on which the four elements of attachment to the material world are sacrificed to awareness or consciousness, which is connected to the divine nature of the universe more directly, instead of sort of second hand in our ego, persona, psyche driven view of the universe, which is basically the experience of the path at the bottom between this and this. And so we have to raise ourselves up onto the cross, and as the Rosicrucian motto goes, through the cross to the rose, and through the rose to the cross, which is then obviously a higher cross on which is the sacrifice of the abyss, which is the sacrifice of all form of identity as a discrete entity experience in reality itself, and that is crossing the abyss right at the top of the grade system. So QShTh acts as a formula at the bottom to keep us grounded, to keep us working and constantly bringing everything that we're doing in our magical work to balanced equilibrium and service at the bottom of the tree, because in effect it is all works of service in different levels. We're always serving the Sephiroth and grade that's above us as we move up the tree of life. So Kof, Shin and Tel, QShTh, is the moon, last judgment, and the world. So to give these keywords, the moon we might have as a cyclic process. The world we might have as synthesis, a bringing together of things. You might say manifestation or earthing. And last judgment is deciding and acting. So in effect, the formula of QShTh, the formula of the rainbow is a recipe, a pattern, a model of action where we're constantly circling around, synthesizing, bringing things together, making decisions based on our awareness of the world, and then acting, coming back again, coming back down the moon path, and going back into a new way of living based on decisions that we do and actions that we do, then coming back across and going round under the rainbow. As the famous saying has it, there is nothing new under the sun. And Tiferet here is the sun. So I'll just put Tiferet there. And in effect, there is a veil, the veil of Paraketh, which also has its own formula, that separates out our everyday life, our normal way of being. You can watch people going through this cycle all of the time now that you know it, and you can see which stage of QShTh that they might be on. They might be saying, I've really got to do something about this, about my job, about my life, about this, that, or the other. And basically they're down here waiting to actually act and make a decision. And as soon as they do, they come back across, and then they have to keep making that decision or then live the new life that is part of having made that decision or taken that action. Say, for example, joining the gym or a choir or deciding to study farming, whatever it may be. It takes them round this cycle again. And in effect, most people live their life down here and are perfectly happy, content within their own view of the world. Down at the bottom, it never gets disturbed. It just goes round and round, and then you die. So what we're doing here as well is on the path that runs across tree of life here, you might not be surprised to see that this path here is actually the blasted tower, So in effect, we have the change that's wrought by this action coming up here that sends you back down into the cycle of the world with a new behavior, a new psyche, a new sense of being, a new identity to some extent. And we go around this cycle as our identity matures over our lifetime, and things happen to us in the world that we then interpret, and how we interpret those things then changes the structure of our psyche, and we build this psyche in connection with the world as it arises. This is our reality, and we go round and round and round, and eventually we die, and that process stops. That's when we are, I guess, forcefully placed onto the cross of sacrifice and removed from our attachment to our physicality in a more dynamic way, I guess is the best way of putting that. Where's the death card? Well, strangely enough, the death card is here on the tree of life. So that's modelled within this as well. So this is the formula of QShTh, and when you're aware of it, you can see where someone might be stuck, where a process might be stuck, where a situation at work might be stuck, and you automatically know whether you've got to blast a tower it, whether you've got to moon it, whether you've got to judgment it, or whether you've got to synthesize it and earth it and bring everything together for an important meeting or discussion so that everything can be laid on the table so you can make a better decision and go around the cycle again. So that is the formula of QShTh. It is the formula of the rainbow. And as far as I am aware, and I'll try and talk while writing simultaneously, the Golden Dawn mention it briefly. They say how important it is, but then they don't talk about it anywhere else. So as far as I'm aware, I was taught this by my second occult teacher, and I've not seen it really anywhere else. That's why I wanted to share it here in a lot more detail under the heading Magical Formula. Now, IAO is another really simple one that you can see in your everyday world. And this is the formula of the light. Let's call this the formula of the light. Formula of the light. And IAO stands for Isis, Apophis, Osiris. So it actually stands for 3 Egyptian gods or deities, goddesses, or netters, and it's Isis, Apophis, Osiris. And in brief, Isis is the great mother, is the creator, is the energy that gives birth. Apophis is the destroyer, and you'll notice that there's a sort of Shiva, Shakti type of creator-destroyer thing going on here. And this is the thing with magical formula. You will find them in all forms of myth, religious teaching, and so forth, because they are, as Crowley was saying, universal patterns. I guess in a sense they're archetypes or archetypal patterns, but because they're not necessarily recognized in the same way as Jungian archetypes, it might be a bit troublesome to call them that, but they are really truly, in the same way that the Platonic forms are archetypes, are basic structures to the entire cosmos as far as we experience it, then these, in that sense, are archetypes as well. In effect, they're constellations. They're constellations of archetypes making a formula out of their components. So Isis, Apophis, Osiris is the creator, the destroyer, and Osiris is here our rebirth, our resurrected form, our transformed post-death, ready to marry Isis again and start the cycle again of Isis, Apophis, Osiris. And Crowley talks about the formula of IAO with, say, for example, when we learn meditation. That's the one he uses, but it goes to all forms of learning. I don't know if you've ever had beginner's luck with something. I remember having it with bowling. The first time I went 10-pin bowling, brilliant. I amazed myself at how easy it was and so forth, but I was so ignorant, naive and unpracticed, I didn't get in my own way. I didn't think about it. I just did it. And quite often you can have beginner's luck at things because you don't get in your own way. You don't know what it's going to be like or how to do it. So the process in effect fits into your rising reality. You intersect with it and you have beginner's luck. But then the second time I went, it wasn't like the first time at all, and I realised how heavy the ball was, how far you had to go, how it was impossible to hold your elbow at the right angle, where you placed your feet. Everything suddenly became a thing because now I knew what it was that I was trying to do, and that's when you get in your own way. And so Isis is that gradual growth, it's the beginner's luck phase. Apophis is when you suddenly realise that it reaches a plateau, that you have to now work at it, that there's a particular lethargy or difficulty or challenge that you can't overcome or seemingly overcome. And you have to recognize that stage in your life, in every process. You have to welcome Apophis into your temple. You have to be able to say, I understand you as a necessary, perhaps evil, but I need you in order to break through, in order to suddenly you then become a little bit better at what you were doing. You suddenly master that chord, you master that kata, you master that thing that you have been trying to do, and then that sets you in our formula of QShTh on another round, or in the formula of IAO back to another stage of growth. So Isis sort of grows, Apophis sort of dips it down, and then Osiris takes it back up again. And it sort of goes up this lightning flash, if you like, of creativity. A friend of mine that I knew who was working in Japan, living in Japan for a long time, called it the W shape, the zigzaggy shape of basically he felt that he understood the culture and he was getting the culture, and then all of a sudden something would just totally spin his head around and he would realize that he didn't understand anything about Japanese culture at all. And then he would get a handle on that, think, okay, now I get it, and go again, and then something would happen again. And I guess it was more of a W shape that sort of zigzagged up like so, because there was a progressive appreciation of the difficulty of understanding another culture. And we get this whether it's learning to play the harp, or whether it is trying to take on a totally new responsibility in the workplace or your job and so forth. We go through these stages, and Isis, Apophis, Osiris is the perfect magical formula for it. And in the Rosy Cross ritual, you actually make the shapes of L. It's sort of like a mourning thing for Isis. V, Scorpio, Apophis, almost like the horns of a goat. And you're making a V shape, and then you make an X shape with your arms, and that is Osiris sort of rising again. So you go through the three stages of LVX in the Rose Cross ritual itself. And it's embedded in here where you say Isis, Apophis, Osiris, and LVX, let the light descend. All of this is applying that formula in a magical ritual. And so that's where you go to apply that particular formula. But you can see it in your everyday life. You can see it when you're helping a friend learn something that you already know. You can see which phase they're at and recognize Apophis and go, this is where we push. This is where we need the breakthrough. The blasted tower moment, if we're looking at the formula of QShTh, in order to push this on. And these formulas do overlap with each other because they're all universal. They are all part of our everyday life, which is also our magical life, whether it's in the temple or in the rest of apparent reality. These formulas work in all cases. That's why they're magical formulas. Now, PRDS, we're going to finish with PRDS, which is the formula of paradise. The formula of paradise. Aleister Crowley does actually make something of a lot of other weird formulas like which is spelt like this, and that's also as in Sanskrit and talks about how that's a magical formula. And he has some really bizarre ones as well. I think he was just stretching his intellectual legs, looking at different ways. And certainly in his diaries, in his notes, it's bonkers just sometimes where he takes things that it never gets into the published books because it's just, it looks like random jottings, but it's a whole series of almost manic notes of this matches this corresponds to this the dental palate of how you say the word "t" has a "t" sound in it, and the plosive sound of "p" sounds correspond with "pay," which is the mouth, which is the blasted tower, which is, and there are pages of his actual notes, diaries and journals full of scrawls like that. Obviously, some of those he would have been writing while he was on various forms of mental stimulant, but it really does show that that's where he was going with it. Florence Farr, in some unpublished writing of hers, also has some sets of correspondence that are quite interesting, and we can see that both Farr and Crowley and other occultists and magicians, including myself, are really looking for these universal patterns to get underneath different layers of reality in order to see the single law that underpins everything. As I think, was it Rudy Rucker or another scientist that said that the universe is a very simple formula or simple rule repeated an impossibly large number of times. And that seems to me to summarize Kabbalah as well. So in effect, we're trying to simplify things by looking at the levels of complexity, but then simplifying them as we go up. So PRDS then, the formula of paradise, I'll look at this on a separate sheet of paper, if I may. In PRDS, we're talking about 4 worlds. And they basically go up like so. So PRDS is the acronym, is the formula, and this is from traditional Kabbalah as well. This is where this formula comes from. And I found it really useful in all of the stuff that I've done, particularly in reviewing tarot decks or reviewing books. This can be used to review films as well, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. But basically, PRDS, which spells out the word PRDS, and as Hebrew has no vowels, then we put the vowels in, and you'll recognize that this is paradise, which you'll know. But also paradise is simply the Hebrew word for garden. So this, in a sense, is the formula of the garden, the formula of paradise. And basically, these are 4 words in Hebrew. So it's 4 words. You don't have to remember necessarily. Or I think I've got the transliteration right. Maybe the pronunciation is the thing I'll butcher. But it's Peshat, Remez, Drosh, and Sod. And this reminds me of the word sodality that we get. But Peshet means literal. Remez means, in effect, symbolic. Drosh means extended. And Sod means secret. Hence sodality, I guess. So we have these 4 levels. PRDS, meaning garden. And this is how Kabbalists would approach sacred text. And as I see the tarot as a illustrated sacred text, then I think this applies to tarot as well. So we have a literal reading of a sacred text, which basically is where a lot of Kabbalistic books say this verse of the Bible has 400 words, it has 5,000 letters, it has 300 occurrences of the letter pay, and so forth. And it's basically a literal description of what we're looking at. I'm reminded of IT work where you always start with the physical layer, and then you move up the transport layer, and then the hardware layer, and then the software layer, and then, well, the operating system layer, the software layer, the application layer, and so forth, the interface layer. you move up, and that's why we get the joke about, have you switched it off and back on again? It's basically shorthand for, let's start at the physical layer first and move up in our problem solving to work out what's going on. And here we start with the literal. Do we understand what we are looking at literally? The symbolic layer is then basically, we now interpret. So we now interpret our observations, or our learning, or our thoughts, or our reading, whatever it may be. So we interpret them. So literally, for a tarot card, we might say this tarot card shows a tower that has bricks falling from it. There are two figures falling out of the tower. It looks like one of them has a crown that is falling off them, and so forth. That's literal, and we mustn't put in any interpretation. And if you want to know how difficult that is and split out your own brain as an exercise for this, one thing is to switch the volume off on television when you're watching something, or watching any screen, any drama, and then try and describe it without the interpretive layer. So instead of saying, I am watching two people fighting, you would actually say, I am watching a man and another man. They are in a constrained area. They are attempting to hit each other. One of them is apparently hitting the other one more, and so forth. And you basically have to describe Rocky 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, whichever version you're watching, and do it without any interpretation at all. And it's really interesting to split your brain out in those layers using this formula, because then it's used a lot in counselling as well, to actually bring people down to understanding what's going on, what's happening, what behaviour is happening, and split it out of the interpretation. And that's where we again get that cliche of, how do you feel about that? How do you interpret that? How do you respond to that? And switching it off and back on again, how do you feel about that? Are all cliches because they're universally true. They come from these patterns, these magical formulae. So if we were watching a film, we'd describe this film was released in 1997. It was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. It was their fourth film. It was 90 minutes long, filmed in Panavision. The director used two different producers. The scriptwriter was so-and-so. It was based on a book by so-and-so. Very literal observations, factual peshet, the first P of Paradise, our garden. Then remez is our symbolic interpretation. This film shows a true underdog story. It is about the bad guy making good. It is about the power of love and will to overcome obstacles that are placed, particularly if you're in a fish out of water scenario, and so on and so on. And basically it's a symbolic interpretation. So we might look at the Blasted Tower card and now say, this card symbolizes falling from a great height. This reminds me, pride becomes a fall. And that's when we go into extended. You might find yourself naturally working through these stages anyway, and you can listen to people doing it as well when they're talking. So the extended phase is more of a sort of comparison and contrast. When exam questions have compare and contrast on them, they're basically asking you to extend your commentary. And this is what we do with tarot. It's what we do with looking at anything in our lives. It's what you do with counselling as well, therapeutic work, change work, self-development work. And it's really when we extend this to other things. So a good film reviewer will have talked about the literal nature of the film. They'll have introduced with that. They will then talk about the symbolic and what the film is really trying to say, what the director has said it's going to be saying. But they might say, this reminds me of, this is similar to the Seven Samurai, and the famous film involving samurai was again a story of similar symbology to this. However, one of the other things that this film tries to do is put itself into the cyberpunk genre. And this is because, and then you basically extend your commentary. You might also say one way of looking at this film is through the lens of architecture, and when you look at how architecture is used in this film, you'll see that it supports the symbolic intent of the film, the themes of the film, and so forth. And basically that relies on your experience and your knowledge and your intuition. But then intuition takes us into this secret level, and this is what I guess Crowley would call the aha moment, what we all call the aha moment, or the core, or the simple truth, or the root, or the point of something. And quite often we can just suddenly get something, and it comes usually from understanding the literal, having explored the symbolic, having run it around our brains for a while, and then all of a sudden it's just like the light bulb moment goes off and we go, I see. In the Matrix, it was only recently, I was today old when I learnt and realised that Neo has to accept a cookie from the Oracle in that scene. And Oracle, as I well know from my own history in IT, is a company, I don't know if they're still going, I assume they are. There was a big company that we used to use SQL databases from Oracle. It was a mainstay, and I understood all of that, and I got the joke about Oracle, but I entirely missed the thing about accepting a cookie in order to progress at that point, and Neo has to accept a cookie. And whether that was deliberate or accidental, almost a secret within a secret, I don't know. But there was an aha moment. And I've long watched the films. I know what the Matrix films are. I've been fascinated by the symbolic nature of the films, the Gnosticism that's buried in the films, and all of the coding language that's used in the films, all of the counterculture stuff that is in the films. I've looked at extended analyses of the films as the politics of gender identity, the politics of big corporations, the politics of AI, technology of AI, and so on and so on. I've been always fascinated with the manga versions of it and its influence on cyberpunk. All of this is all extended, but then one morning you just happen to think, cookie, accepting, do you accept a cookie in order to progress on this screen? Yeah, definitely. So there's always a secret moment that often arises from this. And when you're doing tarot, when you're reading tarot, this formula of paradise really comes in. Because when I've watched tarot readers, hundreds if not thousands of tarot readers over the last 40 odd years, one thing I notice is when they get stuck, they move to the extended. Every single tarot reader I've watched, even well-known authors and experienced readers, when they just get stuck, they have a little bit of a hiccup, they overthink something, or they're trying to formulate in their mind, make a magical formula of their communication, what they want to say, they go to the extended. And this is particularly with, I guess, psychic fair readers that I've experienced, where they will give you some homespun wisdom or some cliches or some popular saying in order to fill the gap whilst they're trying to put together something else. And it becomes extended, but it goes off at an angle. And quite often, if you were to stop them at that point and say, where on that card are you getting, or in this whole spread, are you getting the darkest hour is before the dawn that you just said? And it won't be intuitive, it won't be from the cards themselves, it will just be something that has sparked in their head to say to the person, because they're still trying to figure out what to say from the cards. And my view is, if you're paying for a tarot reading, then that person should be reading the tarot. They should be reading the cards. I don't want to hear their homespun wisdom about something else unless it's relevant to explain the reading to me. And that is why we teach people in Tarosophy, if you get stuck, just go back down to the literal. Immediately drop back down to just saying what you can see on the cards. And I do this, and it sounds a bit lame when you say it, but that's why people tend not to do it. They want to be seen as being wise and knowing. They don't want to suddenly drop down to say, so this card is the Blasted Tower. And on it we can see a tower, and it has two figures. They're both falling. One of them appears to have a crown that has fallen off their head. And this is symbolic of pride cometh before a fall. And I guess in your situation, it's a little bit like you literally said to me a moment ago, didn't you? You've climbed as far as you can go in the company. And you feel good about that, but and then all of a sudden we're back into the reading. We naturally go back up. Whereas if you revert to extended, it's there was a saying I heard recently in a film, I think, that was, in a crisis, we don't rise to our highest aspiration, we fall back to our training. It was something along those lines, and it struck me as really, really perfect in terms of PRDS. When in a crisis, when we're not sure what to do, we don't try and reach for our highest aspiration or our highest purpose or anything. We fall back down to our training and to our knowledge and to our experience and to what we are, the known, where it's a bit like when you're lost, you go back to the last place that you knew where you were, or you try to do that. And this is the formula of paradise time and time again. And you might now realize that a good film reviewer will often, you'll now be able to hear them go through this formula, and quite often, if they talk to the symbols as you understand them, if they're extemporization of the discussion is really interesting, tells you things you didn't know and are unique to that person, then that's why you like them as well. That's why it's useful. And sometimes they'll give you that flashbulb moment of going, I never thought that about the film. Now I'll watch it very differently. Now I'll see something new in it. Thank you. And this is the formula of paradise. It's good in a reading to do, a tarot reading. It's good in all forms of communication. It's good if you want to start off with something reasonably straightforward to explain in a literal way. This is the tree of life. It has these paths. This is how we draw it. And then talk about what a formula is and its symbology and the fact that it's symbolic of ancient Egyptian deities, but then to extend it and see how that can be used in tarot or films or reading a sacred text, and how you can listen and watch for QShTh and IAO in your everyday life, whether it's a supermarket queue or a new job or a new role that you've got. That's the extended. And then there's that secret level at the top of all of this, which is all correspondence systems are a language that we can then put together to formula that then allow us to interact with the world in a totally different way. And there is no difference between living a magical life and living an everyday life. They are one and the same thing. And the more you study, the more you go back to the simplicity that is at the top of the tree of life. And this is where the four worlds come in, because those four worlds are in effect the tree of life, where we start in the literal, we go through the symbolic, we then go to the extended, and then we go to the secret worlds as we move up. And this is the formula of paradise. This is paradise. This is our garden. This is the one and only garden that exists. It is all existence, and it is predicated by magical formula. And I hope that gives you some encouragement as well to dive back in between the chapters of all of the exciting stuff about doing rituals and about magical pentacles and things like this, and start to look at these in-between chapters like the formula of the neophyte in magic and theory and practice, and perhaps get a new insight into what magic is all about. Crowley goes to great lengths quite often in the chapters that I've noted about magical formula, about why it is so important to do this, why it's essential for a magician to do this, why he doesn't think that a lot of people who say that they're magicians are magicians because they don't understand the language of magic, the application of it, the formula of it, because they're too busy trying to invoke demons or practicing witchcraft, in his terminology at least, not what we understand today as witchcraft. And it's there. When you read it, it's actually in there. And I've found over the last 40 years or so, it's really important. It's worth studying. It's practical. It helps you understand the universe. It helps you then understand the language that's underneath a lot of magical practice. And hopefully it improves and, I guess, deepens your life rather than makes it more complicated or further away from magic. And you start to see things that you might not have seen before, and that is literally what we mean by peering through the veil of Paraketh. And now you'll think, perhaps, I hope, that Paraketh, that's a word that means veil, and that's spelt with Hebrew letters. They have corresponding tarot cards. I wonder what the formula of Paraketh is, and what that can teach me about life, the universe, and everything. And there I shall leave you, because as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop.